The Sukhoi Su-9 was one of the earliest Soviet jet fighters developed in the Soviet Union shortly after World War II. It was the first jet aircraft designed by Sukhoi and was influenced by the captured German Messerschmitt Me 262, which was the first fighter with a jet engine. Even though the Su-9 looked similar to the Me 262, it wasn't exactly a copy except the engine. The Su-9 was a twin-engine all-metal aircraft with trapezoidal wings, an oval-shaped fuselage, and a braking parachute to help with landings. It had outer flaps which could serve as air brakes, and it was also the first Soviet aircraft to use hydraulic-powered controls. This jet basically marks the beginning of Soviet jet technology, which would go pretty crazy in the future, as we've seen with the MiG-25 for example. Anyways, today's video is going to be about the Su-9 jet fighter. So hello and welcome and enjoy this video. The development of the jet engines among the four major powers USA, Great Britain, Germany and the Soviet Union started only in the late 1930s, with Britain and Germany being much further in development than the others. The origins of the Su-9 date back to 1944, when the Soviet military began emphasizing the need for an advanced jet fighter to catch up with the technological developments being made by Germany and Britain. By this time, Germany had already fielded the Messerschmitt 262, which was the world's first operational jet fighter. Pavel Sukhoi, head of the Sukhoi Design Bureau, was tasked with developing a new twin-engine jet fighter which would use German technology as a basis, but would be adapted to suit Soviet needs. The project was designated as Project K. Other requirements for Sukhoi were for the jet to have a maximum speed at sea level of 850 km an hour, a maximum speed of 880 km an hour at an altitude of 3000 meters, a range at maximum speed of 880 km, have to climb to 5000 meters, be 5.7 minutes, and a service ceiling of 12,500 meters. Reason for Project K was that at the time, domestic Soviet engines were not yet ready for operational use. To bridge this technological gap, the decision was made to use copies of German engines which had already been captured by Soviet forces. The major aircraft designers, Mikoyan, Yakovlev, and as for the Su-9, Sukhoi, were all working on developing jet engines based off of the German ones. Yakovlev replaced the piston engine in the Yak-3 with an RD-10, initially Jumo 004 jet engine, turning it into the Yak-15. The MiG-9 on the other hand was a completely new design and had two RD-20, initially German BMW 003 engines. Sukhoi, however, wanted to go a different way. He didn't want to use a copy of the German engines, but instead wanted to build his own engine. This would be the S-18. Work started on developing this experimental turbojet engine based on the pre-war RD-1 project. The plan was to use the S-18 in Sukhoi's new jet aircraft. However, during testing, the S-18, which had already passed the initial low-speed tests, was destroyed when it moved to higher speeds. This was also the first time a compressor stall happened in the USSR. Because his plan for his own engine failed, he had to go with developing his Project K based on the German Me 262 Jumo 004B engine. The Soviet version of the engine was designated RD-10 and it would be the one to power the new aircraft. In October 1945, the preliminary project of the aircraft, codenamed L within the Sukhoi Bureau, was approved by the 7th Main Directorate of the People's Commissariat of Aviation Industry. During the design and construction of the prototype, the fighter changed its factory code from K and received the designation Su-9. The design of the Su-9 began with the goal of quickly producing a jet fighter based on known aerodynamic principles to avoid unnecessary risks. As already mentioned, the Su-9 was not a direct copy of the Me 262, but it borrowed key concepts such as engine placement and fuselage design, which made it visually similar to the Me 262. The aircraft was made as a twin-engine, low-wing plane with trapezoid-shaped wings which were simpler to build and maintain. Another reason why they used these wings was because of the lack of Soviet experience in high-speed aerodynamics. So unlike the Me 262, the Su-9 had trapezoidal wings instead of swept wings. The fuselage shape and landing gear was also quite different. The Me 262 had a triangular fuselage cross-section, whereas the Su-9 had an oval one. Even though the Su-9 had wings that weren't ideal for high speeds, it actually performed better than the Me-262. With almost the same weight, it was a bit smaller, could fly 100 kilometers farther, and reach 600 meters higher than the Me-262. It also had a higher top speed of reaching 885 kilometers an hour at 8,000 meters, compared to the Me-262's 870 kilometers an hour at 6,000 meters. The engines were placed under the wings. Reason for that was that the RD-10 engine, just like the German Jumo 004, had a pretty short lifespan, so putting them under the wings made maintenance and replacement easier. This setup also freed up some space inside the main body, which was then used for large fuel tanks because early jet engines used a lot of fuel. Those tanks had a total volume of 2,300 liters and were placed in the forward part of the fuselage, behind and in front of the pilot, together with the armament. Between the tanks, under the cockpit floor, was the compartment for retracting the main landing gear. Before the model was presented to anyone, the chief designer was asked to make changes to the armor layout, weapon setup, fuel system, and special equipment based on feedback. They also had to think about adding takeoff boosters and designing a pressurized cockpit. After the conclusion was approved, Colonel General Repin, chief designer of the Red Army Air Force, said, "The characteristics of the aircraft as designed in the preliminary project are too low for aircraft of 1947 series production. The maximum speed must be increased to 900 kilometers, and the other comments on the project must be addressed, except for the pressurized cockpit. The design of the fighter should allow for the installation of Jumo engines with a thrust of up to 1,200 kilograms. By January 1st, 1946, all the drawings for the model had been given to the workshops. Before showing the model to the State Commission, the designers made changes to the wing and fuselage design, strengthened the cockpit armor, and added the option to equip it with bombs. On February 7, 1946, the State Commission reviewed the model, which was approved by Marshal of Aviation Novikov, commander of the Red Army Air Force, on February 16 with some feedback. On February 26, 1946, the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR approved a plan for building experimental aircraft for 1946 to 47. This decree, along with an order from March 27, 1946, required Chief Designer Sukhoi and Director of Plant No. 134 to design and build a single-seat fighter with two Jumo 004 engines, build two prototypes, and have the first one ready for flight tests by November 1st, 1946. And that was exactly what they did. While designing and building the prototype aircraft, several changes were made, mainly to the airframe, landing gear, and equipment. There were also some problems due to a lack of experimental data at Tsagi on new high-speed designs, so recommendations kept changing as calculations and experiments were done, which made previous suggestions unreliable. Because of this, the wing drawings had to be changed 3 times during the design process. Also, work on the aircraft happened at the same time as they got an extra task to design and build the UTB-2 training bomber. The Su-9 was a twin-engine, low-wing monoplane with a length of about 10.5 meters and a wingspan of 11.2 meters. It had an empty weight of 4,060 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 6,100 kilograms. The aircraft was powered by 2 RD-10 turbojet engines. It had a maximum speed of 895 kilometers an hour at an altitude of 8,000 meters, a service ceiling of 12,250 meters, and a range of 1,140 kilometers. The armament consisted of one 37mm N-37 cannon, two 23mm NS-23 cannons, and could swap the N-37 for a 45mm N-45 cannon. There was also an option to install 4 NS-23 cannons. A PBP-1 sight was installed in the cockpit for aiming, and shooting accuracy was checked with a POW-27 sign gun in the nose. 2 easily removable bomb racks under the front of the fuselage allowed for carrying 2 FOB-250 bombs, or one FAB 500 bomb. However, if bombs were used, the M37 cannon had to be removed, or else the takeoff weight would be too high. In the original design, the Su-9 wasn't supposed to carry bombs because it was meant for active combat against enemy fighters and bombers. But by the time they showed the model to the State Commission, the designers had also made it possible to equip it with bombs. The landing gear was a tricycle arrangement with double tires on the nose gear and single tires on the main gear. The aircraft was equipped with split flaps that could act as air brakes, and it also had provisions for jet-assisted takeoff bottles to shorten its takeoff distance. The J-tow was needed because the Su-9 was designed with a very high wing load, which made it faster and more compact. However, this also meant higher takeoff and landing speeds. The cockpit was armored with a 12mm thick front armor plate, a 10mm thick rear armor plate, and bulletproof glass 64mm thick at the front and 50mm at the rear. This is how the cockpit dashboard looks like. The first prototype was finished on September 18, 1946 and then moved to the Flight Research Institute airfield for testing. Bad weather delayed the first flight, but eventually it happened on November 13, 1946, with the test pilot Georgy Shianov flying it. The flight test faced a lot of issues like frequent engine failures, landing gear adjustments, problems with the hydraulic system, and bad weather. On top of that, the first flight showed a problem with the aileron control system. It would jam at speeds over 480 km an hour. Several changes were made to the ailerons, like adjusting the shape of the leading edge and reducing aerodynamic compensation, but none of them worked. The issue was finally fixed by adding 4mm angles along the top and bottom of the ailerons. The testing program got delayed. Because of this, in early February 1947, Sukhoi asked the Air Force leadership for help in making a small series of 3 to 5 more Su-9s, which could speed up factory testing and take part in the May 1, 1947 air parade. The Air Force Commander Marshall supported the idea, but the Minister of Aviation Industry thought it was too early. In the meantime, testing of the Su-9 continued. The biggest change made during the testing phase was adding an ejection seat. As we know, when flight speeds and altitudes get higher, issues come up with keeping the crew safe in emergencies, which need special solutions. Because of this, on January 25, 1946, the NKAP issued an order calling on measures to ensure the safety of aircraft crews in high-speed aircraft accidents. It required all chief designers to install ejection seats on new experimental aircraft with a top speed over 700 km an hour, similar to those on the HE-162 and HE-219 aircraft. To follow this order, Sukhoi's specialists used the HE-162 ejection seat as a starting point and improved upon it. They increased the controlled movement of the seat inside the cockpit, which reduced the G-forces on the pilot during ejection. Preliminary calculation shows that the improved seat made safe ejection possible at 30% higher speeds than the original version. The seat was tested using the fuselage of an Su-9 meant for static tests. A winch was used to check if the pilot could safely exit while wearing the winter gear, and ground ejections with a mannequin were also done with everything filmed. They concluded that the seat was reliable and safe, allowing it to be installed on the aircraft. The seat was installed at the end of March 1947, and by mid-April, the cockpit was made larger and the canopy's hinged section was replaced to ensure safe flights. By July 1947, due to adjustments and modifications, the factory testing of the Su-9 went way beyond the original plan, with 60 flights instead of just 14. In August 1947, the Su-9 was shown to the public at the air parade at Moscow's Tushino airfield. After its public debut, the Su-9 began stage trials on August 18, 1947. During the stage trials, they worked on things that hadn't been tested during factory tests, like figuring out dive characteristics, taking off with an overload weight, reaching the maximum Mach number, testing the aircraft's strength at loads, shooting at ground targets, bombing, and testing special equipment in flight. They also ran a separate program to test the upgraded N-37 number 20 OKB 16 MV cannon. To improve the takeoff and landing performance of the aircraft, the Air Force asked Plant Number 134 to design and make the necessary parts. In early November, experimental U-5 boosters were installed on the aircraft. At the same time, a braking parachute system, based on a system from the captured German AR-234 aircraft, was also added. Tests showed that the boosters cut the takeoff distance almost in half, and with the braking parachute and flaps, the landing distance was reduced from 1080 meters to 660 meters. However, by the end of testing, the future of the aircraft was still uncertain. In mid-November 1947, some OKB-134 employees wrote to General Bulganin, the USSR Minister of the Armed Forces, suggesting that the Su-9 should go into mass production, even though the state trials weren't finished yet. A similar letter was sent to Stalin in early December, but nothing came of it. Besides that, the results from the state trials were pretty positive. Compared to other jet fighters, the Su-9 stood out for being easier to maintain on the ground and having strong weapons. Test pilots also found the Su-9 easier to fly compared to other Soviet jet fighters in production, like the MiG-9 and Yak-15. One of the additional goals in the aircraft development plan for 1946 to 1950 was to add a radar. A government order from July 17, 1947 gave them the job of developing the first domestic airborne intercept radar called Thorium. At the Air Force's request, Sukhoi's design bureau started working on using the Su-9 as an interceptor fighter in the spring of 1947. By mid-December, this work was almost done. Based on this, the state test results of the Su-9, Sukhoi presented his plan for the step-by-step development of the interceptor to the Air Force Commander-in-Chief. And I quote, "The design of the aircraft stays the same except for the nose section, which will have the thorium intercept radar and two 37mm cannons. At the same time, instruments for blind landings are also planned. So the flight performance of the Su-9 as seen in state tests will basically stay the same. The aircraft's performance will improve a lot in the second half of 1948 when the new RD-14 engines come out. These engines are the same weight and size as the RD-10, so they can be installed without any changes. With the RD-14 engines, the aircraft's top speed at sea level and at altitude will be 950 km an hour and 925 km an hour, and the climb rate to 5 km and 10 km will be reduced to 2.8 and 7.1 minutes. Since serial production of the aircraft can start in the summer of 1948, almost all production aircraft will have RD-14 engines. At the same time, I've designed an upgraded interceptor version of the Su-9 with two RD-500 engines and a pressurized cockpit. The maximum speed at sea level is 975 km an hour, and at an altitude of 5,000 meters, it is 960 km an hour. It takes 2.5 minutes to reach 5,000 meters. The flight range at 10,000 meters in normal mode is 1,550 kilometers. The takeoff run without boosters is 500 meters. Considering all of this, I request your support for starting serial production of the Su-9. This aircraft and its future upgrades will solve the issue of intercepting enemy planes for the next 3 to 5 years." End of quote. On December 18, 1947, the state trials were finished with 53 flights done during the trials and a total of 123 flights and 53 hours and 15 minutes of flight time since testing began. The state trials report highlighted, "This aircraft has the following advantages compared to similar domestic planes already in production. Easier to fly and simpler to maintain on the ground. With takeoff boosters and a braking parachute, it can be used at airfields alongside piston engine planes. Powerful weapons, fully effective at all altitudes and speeds. Good amount of special equipment, communication and navigation tools. Can easily have the thorium search radar added, making it suitable as an interceptor. Its technical data matches that of planes already in production." At the same time, a few issues were found that needed fixing, mainly increasing the maximum allowable Mach number and reducing the control stick force. In January 1948, along with the state trials report for the Su-9, the Air Force leadership prepared a draft letter to Stalin and a draft government decree to approve the report for the Su-9 fighter. The draft decree included starting serial production of the Su-9 at plant number 153 in Novosibirsk in an interceptor version with a pressurized cockpit with the option to install the thorium radar. It also required an interceptor with 2 RD-500 engines and the thorium radar to be ready for state trials by August 1948. Basically, they asked for permission to work on this variant of the Su-9. In early February, these documents were sent to the Minister of Aviation Industry for approval. 2 months went by, but the ministers hadn't responded. At the end of March, they asked again to speed up the review of the Su-9 materials. In early April, the Air Force commander got a new proposal from Sukhoi along with a response from the Minister of Aviation Industry. Sukhoi suggested to start serial production of the Su-9 using the current design, which already includes a pressurized cockpit and changes in the nose for the intercept radar. In 1948, an experimental version of the Su-9 with RD-500 engines, a new wing, and a new horizontal tail was to be designed and built. Doing these two things at the same time would cut down the development time for the new interceptor by 1 to 1.5 years. In response to Vershin's request, Khrushchev wrote that he agreed with report number 180 on the state test results of Sukhoi's experimental Su-9. Since the Su-9's performance met the government's requirements, the Ministry of Aviation Industry could approve it for serial production, but only if it stays in production for at least 2 years. A shorter production period wouldn't have made up for the high setup costs. The suggestion to produce Su-9s with the new RD-500 engines, radar for finding targets in clouds, and 37mm cannons was a big change and essentially meant creating a new aircraft. Such an aircraft could be designed and built as an experimental model, and they could decide on its serial production after state trials. He asked that this matter be brought to the Minister of Armed Forces, Comrade Bulganin, for consideration. A memo for Minister Bulganin was quickly prepared along with a new draft government decree. In this draft, plant number 153 was replaced with plant number 381 from Moscow, and a point was added for putting the Su-9 into service as an interceptor. In the memo, the Air Force commander defended his position, stating, "Comrade Khrushchev did not agree to start serial production of the Su-9 in the interceptor version proposed by the Air Force and instead wanted it to be built in the frontline fighter version. I could not agree with Comrade Khrushchev's proposal and insisted on launching the Su-9 in the interceptor version, as indicated in Comrade Stalin's letter and the draft Council of Ministers decree. Chief Designer Comrade Sukhoi agreed with the Air Force proposal. On April 3rd, the documents were sent to the USSR Minister of Armed Forces, and a few days later they were returned with the decision to agree with Comrade Khrushchev's proposal. The Air Force proposal was seen as unacceptable. In the situation, Vershinin had no choice but to accept the Minister of Aviation Industry's proposal. However, during all this back and forth, a lot of time had been lost and interest in the Su-9 as a frontline fighter had faded. In March 1948, the government decided to start serial production of the MiG-15 fighter, which better met the current needs. However, while the serial production issue was being sorted out, booster mechanisms were added to the Su-9's control system for the ailerons and elevator to fix the problems found during the stage trials. Back in September 1946, an experimental lab was set up at OKB 134 to improve hydraulic and pneumatic drives used in the aircraft and work on new designs. Within a year, the lab completed several projects, including creating a hydraulic booster drive to reduce the force on the pilot, which was included in the control system in a reversible setup. In the fall of 1947, the booster mechanism passed flight tests on the UTB-2 flying lab. Extra factory tests on the Su-9 with the booster mechanisms were done from April to June 1948. In early June 1948, Chief Designer Ilyushin of plant number 240 requested a set of drawings of the Su-9 booster mechanism, which was then sent to him. On July 30, 1948, due to funding being cut, the Su-9 was written off. So despite all the development effort, the Su-9 didn't enter production. The MiG-9 and Yak-15, which had been developed concurrently, were more advanced in terms of engine technology and overall performance. By the time the Su-9 completed its state trials, it was clear that it was no longer competitive with the newer designs. The government decided against mass production of the Su-9. The Su-9 project was officially cancelled in 1948. The Su-9's cancellation also coincided with changes within the Soviet aviation industry. In November 1949, the Sukhoi Design Bureau was temporarily dissolved, further hindering any efforts to continue the development of the Su-9 or its variants. It wasn't until the early 1950s that the bureau was re-established. The development of the Su-9 did not end with the cancellation of its mass production. The Sukhoi Design Bureau continued to work on improved versions of the aircraft, leading to the creation of the Su-11 and the proposed Su-13. Another prototype was started in 1946, but this one was supposed to use the Yakovlev-designed version of the RD-10F engine with an afterburner. However, wind tunnel tests in September showed that the drag could be reduced if the engines were placed inside the wings instead of underneath, and if the wingtips were redesigned with a different shape to reduce Mach tug. These changes meant the entire wing had to be redesigned. Before the prototype was finished, Sukhoi was ordered to use the Lyulka TR-1 turbojet engine. This aircraft was named the Su-11 and called Samolyet KL by the design bureau. Each TR-1 engine produced less thrust than needed. The aircraft made its first flight on May 28, 1947, and also took part in the flight past at Tushino in August. It had a top speed of 940 km an hour at sea level, but flight tests showed it had stability issues at high speeds. Changes to the wing connections and lengthening the engine nacelles didn't fix the problem. Combined with the lack of reliable TR-1 engines, these issues led to the program being cancelled. The Su-13 was the final attempt to further improve the basic Su-9 design. It was intended to use Klimonov RD-500 engines, which were Soviet copies of the British Rolls-Royce Warrant engines. The Su-13 also featured a modified wing design with a thinner airfoil and swept tailplanes, as well as an upgraded armament consisting of 3 37mm cannons. A night fighter version of the Su-13 equipped with radar was also proposed, but neither the standard nor the night fighter versions made it off the drawing board. The ongoing production of the more advanced jet fighters like the MiG-15 and Yak-23, as well as the dissolution of the Sukhoi Design Bureau, ultimately put an end to the Su-13 project. There was also an Su-9T, which was supposed to be a two-seat trainer version of the original Su-9 fighter with an extra cockpit and limited weapons and space. Anyways, that was all I had to say for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you think I said anything that is not right, or you think I should have added any additional information to this video, please let me know in the comments and share your knowledge. Besides that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.